And then as 1919 started and the War of Independence got into full swing, morale in the RIC was very poor. Much of the RIC barracks in the country, in the rural areas, were closed, and the constables went into town, into bigger barracks. And as they left the country barracks, the IRA came along and burned the places down so they couldn't come back. But by 1920, the British government had sensed that if they were going to stay in the country and keep control of the country, they had to keep law and order. So they proposed to hire 10,000 recruits and hit on the idea that they would take in recruits who were men who had fought in the First World War, but on their return to England and Ireland as well, they found themselves unemployed. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister at the time, said when they were returning, he was thanking them for the good job they'd done. He said, "You're going to return to a land of milk and honey." But in reality, they came to a land that was full of unemployment. So they were, for 2 years at least, they were knocking around street corners, little or no money, and this job came up. And the pay on offer was 10 shillings a day, and they would be on duty for the full week. So they got 70 shillings a week. So that was the 9,000 or 10,000 auxiliaries that were going to be recruits for the RIC. They were going to be RIC cadets and be trained in law and order and so on. And then allied to that was another 1,900 who were called the auxiliaries. And they were recruited from the British Army, former British Army officers. And they were used mainly for intelligence, but they were also very, very fierce fighters and very determined people, and much feared by the population of the country. And at the same time, when these men were recruited, we still had 10,000 RIC men, and we had a standing army, British Army in the country of 40,000 men. So it's quite a large body of men to keep controlling the country. And they thought by recruiting these men, they would get law and order and cut out the fighting and win over the population. But the reverse was the situation. Eventually, leading up to the attack on KNOCKCROGHERY, it really started with the capture of Sean McKeown. Sean McKeown was an officer commanding in County Longford. He was called the Blacksmith of Ganly, and he was an iconic figure. He was fearless, he was a good organiser, and he was the man in charge of the flying column in County Longford. And there was one particular day in January 1921, he was in a safe house, and there was 2 women in the house at the time, and he heard a small contingent of British Army and RIC that were about to enter the house and try and capture him. So he got out the back of the house and hid for a while, and then burst out in the street with his guns, started firing at the British Army men, and he had a couple of Mills bombs with him as well. And he threw one of them, and it exploded. Now when the dust settled, 2 men were wounded, one was wounded, and an RIC sergeant was killed. And the rest of the contingent of the British Army had run away. So later on in the year, in early June, Sean, who was a member of the IRB Secret Society, he was called to Dublin for a meeting with Collins and a few others. And on his return, he took a train from Dublin to Mullingar. And when the train arrived in Mullingar, every passenger was told to get out on the platform. Obviously they knew he was on the train, or someone had informed him that he was on the train. So one of the policemen recognised him and went to arrest him, and McKeown started to run. And a volley of shots came out and he was wounded. He got a bullet in the lung. And he was brought off to Dublin to a military hospital and then put into Mountjoy prison. And then there was a military trial shortly after, and he was put on trial for the murder of the sergeant that had died from the result of the Mills bomb earlier in the year. And he was found guilty. He was sentenced to be hanged, and the sentence was to be held about 3 weeks after the court case, towards the end of June. Now, he was so highly regarded by both Collins and the hierarchy of the IRA, and also his local contingent in Longford. Attempts were made to try and rescue him. And Collins had a group of men captured a British Army lorry and some uniforms, and somehow or other they got him to Mountjoy prison. And they went to the block in the prison that they assumed he was in, but he wasn't there, he couldn't move. And a fight ensued, and the IRA contingent had to retreat. No one was killed or injured, but obviously the attempt to release McKeown had failed. And then there was another attempt to rescue him, and this was led by his contingent in County Longford. They were anxious to release him, and they hit on the idea that if they were to capture a British Army officer, they would barter him for the life of Sean McKeown. So a contingent of the IRA from Coverclare in County Westmeath were given the task of conducting an ambush. General Lambert and Colonel Challoner and their wives had a habit of going to Killinure House to play tennis, and this was well known. And this contingent from Coverclare set up an ambush, so when they were returning to go to Athlone, two men came out on the road with rifles. Lambert saw what was going on and he told his wife who was driving to put the boot down, keep going, don't stop. And they got through those two men without any harm. But further down the road, another 6 or 8 men came out on the road and started firing. Lambert was shot in the neck and mortally wounded, and Challoner's wife got telephones in the face. They eventually got back to Athlone, and Lambert was brought to the hospital, and I assume it was the hospital in the workhouse, because there was no hospital in the town at that time. And he died around 9 o'clock that evening. And it was too late that evening for, say, the army intelligence people plus the RAC to go out chasing people because they'd be long gone. But the next day they were out around Coulson and Killinure, and they were asking questions from known IRA people and so on, and all the people who lived there. And somebody just said, in an offhand sort of way, I saw 2 men running in that direction, he pointing towards Coulson Point. And the British authorities took it up that these men got away by boat and headed towards Ganly Bay, which was the nearest point of land from Coulson Point. And then the nearest built up area to Ganly Bay would have been KNOCKCROGHERY. So the Black and Tans that night decided KNOCKCROGHERY was going to be attacked. And at 11 o'clock that night they came across the railway line and they stopped at the first house they came to, which was the presbytery. Now they wouldn't have known that, but they banged on the door, and Father Barclay Kelly, who was the PP at the time, he was in bed. And he refused to answer the door. They kept on banging and they told him they were going to burn the house down. And Barclay Kelly got out the back window onto a flat roof, a shed at the back, down onto the ground, and ran across the field to Canon Humphreys, who was the rector for the Church of Ireland. And he told him what was going to happen and so on. But in the meantime, the Tans had set fire to his front door and then moved on up the village. And local neighbours who saw what had gone on to the front door of the house, they managed to throw clay and soil on it and put the fire out. So there was little or no damage to the priest's house, except a scorched front door and a bit of smoke damage inside. They went on up the village then to the widow Pat's, and she pleaded with them. Her husband was dead, she had some small children with her, and eventually decided to leave her alone. And the next house they went to then was this Murray's here. John S. Murray had just arrived only 4 years before and started the business here. And they were inside questioning him and arguing the toss about what they were going to do. One half of this building was the post office, and the other half was John S.'s hardware store and grocery store. And they came to the conclusion that the post office was Crown property, they wouldn't burn it down. But while they were in the kitchen, John S. had his jacket draped over the back of the chair, and one of the Tans was searching through his pockets to see what he could get. And young James Murray, only 3 years at the time, started kicking out at the Black and Tan and told him to leave his daddy's jacket alone. But his footwork sort of betrayed what he'd be like on the football field 20 years later. But they went on down the village then, Corley's, they set fire to that, and set fire to several other shops and businesses down the town. And at the time there were 8 Claypipe manufacturing facilities here in the village. All of them were destroyed. And of course all the people who worked in those Claypipe manufacturing facilities, they all lost their jobs. Many of them lost their homes, they lost their possessions, and everyone was deprived. As they went down the town, they kept setting fire to houses, especially those that had thatched roofs. They're very easy to set alight. And when they finished, they were down at the northern end of the town, at the village, at the bridge near the mill. And they sat on the bridge, laughing and having great fun at the distress of all the residents running in and out of the houses trying to save property and going around in their night clothes and so on. And they kept firing shots up in the air and trying to frighten them. And 15 houses were burned to the ground that day. And